Good evening, everyone. You're very welcome to our first lecture in our new family webinar series created by the Department of Social Work in St. Patrick's Mental Health Services. My name is Elaine Donnelly and I'm a social work team leader here in the hospital, and I'm really delighted to join you this evening to talk a little bit about mental health recovery and what it's like for a family member supporting a loved one with a mental health difficulty or an addiction problem. I'll tell you a little bit about what the series involves and what we're hoping to gain and achieve through this webinar series, which will be unfolding over the next number of months and will go on for the next year. So mental health recovery, a family perspective, is an information series. Basically, we know that often when family members are trying to help a loved one, they often find it really difficult to access basic practical information about their loved one's illness, about what would help them, about what would help themselves as a family. So really what we're aiming to do with this webinar series is to provide practical specific information, to provide a space for supporters to consider their own needs for emotional support, and to recognise ultimately the unique and vital role that families play in times of illness and crisis. I should say that I'm using the word family, but really that's a catch-all term to describe anyone in any role who might be supporting somebody with a mental health difficulty. So you may be a friend, you may be a relative, you may be a partner, but family is the term that we'll use for this series, and we hope it might fit what your role is. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about the role the families might play and how this might affect them and how this might affect the family system. We're going to talk a little about some of the key issues that we know families would talk about experiencing when they're supporting somebody through recovery and on their recovery journey. And then we're going to just divide, I suppose, the approach into two sections. The first one is about caring for others. So kind of practical information about what might help you in your supporter role. And then the second part of that is thinking about what might help you in your supporter role and how best to access the supports that you might need. Now, it would be beyond the scope of this lecture to cover all the issues that family members experience, because we know it's wide ranging and it's very unique, dependent on you as a family and where you are coming from. So perhaps you're coming to this lecture as somebody who's very new to mental health services, who's very new to the experience of illness from a family point of view, or perhaps you've been supporting somebody for quite some time and this, you're not new to this role, and these issues are not perhaps new to you, but you're looking for more information and more ways to think about how to support yourself. So we hope this lecture will set the scene for the coming webinars, which are intended to be more specific and more defined in terms of their focus. So in the coming months, we'll focus on issues like trauma recovery, addiction, eating distress, how diagnoses are made and what their role might be in terms of recovery pathways. And we'll be thinking about issues like emotional regulation and issues like anxiety. So a broad range of areas which may be applicable to you dependent on your loved one's needs and dependent on your own needs as well. So I suppose before we get started talking about families, it's important to consider what exactly we're talking about when we talk about recovery. So recovery is described as a deeply personal, unique process of changing one's attitudes, values, feelings, goals, and or roles. So it's much broader than the concept of recovery. It's just clinical recovery, which is where I suppose professionals would look to remove symptoms and remove experience of symptoms by the person. Whereas recovery in this sense is thinking about all the different aspects of your life. It's about taking a holistic focus when you're thinking of your goals and your wishes for your own life. And there's a number of key elements to that recovery which have been researched and identified in the literature. So the first one is connection. And this is really essential to what we're talking about here this evening. So we know that support is an essential part of anyone's recovery. We know that we all need support in good times and bad, and that often the experience of mental ill health can leave us feeling alone, even if we know that there is support there for us. And it's just about connecting into that support and what makes it easier to make those connections. So other elements that we know are really key to recovery is hope. and hope for the future, hope for your goals, and having that sense of what good is yet to come. Identity, meaning, and empowerment. These are all really important aspects of recovery that it's important we focus in on, along with what supports are available. Where do family members fit into that? So I suppose we know that family members unquestionably play a really key role in supporting people in their recovery, in their care plan, and whatever pathway they might take. So research suggests that family involvement can have really significant benefits for service users, particularly in terms of relapse prevention. But we know that support generally is really important for everybody's mental health and well-being, and family involvement is key to that. We know that family members are often the only constant support in people's lives at times, and will often know the individual best. This is not always the case, but we know that very often you're very close up and you have a different perspective and a different angle on the experience of your loved one, which is valuable to consider. Family involvement can also support the family system to manage the impact of the illness, and thereby support the individual to maintain their own well-being and also look after family well-being as well. So I suppose within that, it's important to consider what family recovery might look like. So we know that that personal recovery is about thinking about your own values and goals and attitudes and taking a holistic view on things. Family recovery is about re-establishing goals, ambitions, and lives. It's about learning to maintain well-being and resilience so that we can continue to support our family members, friends' recovery. So that's the definition that's been taken from a really great booklet that's done by Mental Health Ireland and the Mental Health Engagement Service, Mental Health and Family Caring, Supporting the Supporters. And the reference for that will be at the end of the slides, but I would highly recommend looking that up if you want to know more about that. I suppose it's suggested that family recovery is about understanding the challenges we are facing and acknowledging, I suppose, some of the stress that comes with that and how it impacts on us as individuals. It's about respecting and accepting that while we all see things differently, we all have different perspectives on things, that there are key skills we can draw on to live alongside the person we're trying to support, and to all live together with hope, empathy, equality, and autonomy. So it's learning to care about our relatives and feel supported is what it's all about. So I suppose it's important to say at the outset, because this is often a really common occurrence for family members, is that they want to help, but they feel unable to get the information they might need. They're unsure about what role they should or could play. And often, I suppose, when they go to provide information or they go to look for information, they might be told that confidentiality prohibits them from getting the information that they might need. So it's worth noting that all health professionals are legally required to maintain patient confidentiality, but there's some exceptions. These include if a person is given the permission to share the personal information. So if your family member consents to do so, that information can be shared with you as a family or friend. And there's also other exceptions to sharing information, which include if we feel that somebody might be at risk to themselves or to others, and that's particularly in regard to children or vulnerable adults. So I suppose when you're trying to get information, you can often feel excluded. And often family members speak about feeling outside of the process, even though they very much lived alongside it and lived within it, up until maybe the point of admission or point of engagement with a mental health team. It's important to note that family involvement is guided by individual wishes and rights. It's worth saying also that if permission is not given for you to be involved, you can still provide information, whether that's by phone or by email, maybe noting down some things that you think would be important for the health professional team to know, or any kind of general information that you may be able to get. So for example, if you know a person's diagnosis, that maybe you might be able to ask for general information on what that diagnosis involves, what kind of treatments are recommended, and where do you fit in as a family. It's also important to note that things can change over time. So very often people will say that they don't want family involved, or they'll make a decision not to share information, particularly if they're feeling unwell or they're feeling particularly vulnerable. these dynamics and these situations can change dependent on lots of different things. So it's important to revisit these decisions and agreements regularly, so that you know you can access the information you might need. So we know that that is really important because family members are often dealing with complex situations without training, without knowledge, without a break, and with someone they have a strong emotional attachment to. And this is really key. This is what's different when you're supporting a family member or a friend. Watching someone you love go through periods of distress and go through periods of illness can really impact on how we approach the situation, and how we cope with the situation. So we also know that the expertise of individuals and their families should be acknowledged and valued, despite maybe any kind of challenges with confidentiality that might arise. We know that family members need specific things from services, and this has been evidenced in literature. So family members will often say they need to feel like their relative is safe and is getting the care they need. And that can be difficult to know if maybe there's not been consent given for you to know information about maybe their treatment pathway. Keeping the family informed about their relatives' progress, ensuring families have access to information about the mental health system, which can allay some anxiety, not all anxiety, but can certainly allay some fears and worries that families might have, and working in partnership with families where possible and as guided by the individual wishes. So I suppose I've talked there a little bit about the important role that family members play and how important it can be for the individual who may be in recovery. How does that experience impact on families, and how do families members describe that for themselves? So we know a recurrent theme and a major issue when you're speaking with family members, and you will know this if you were supporting somebody with a mental illness or an addiction issue, is that feeling of uncertainty and that feeling of powerlessness. So that can create a lot of anxiety because it's a very out of control place to be, to not have the information you might need, and to deeply care about somebody and not sure what happens next. And that goes for any illness. We can all experience that if our family member is unwell, it's quite an uncertain place to be, and that can create lots of different emotions. Family members, as I've said, a number of times now, often lack the information they may need. And that could be for lots of reasons. Maybe it's that consent hasn't been given, but also maybe it's you're not sure what role that you should play. You're not sure how best to get the information you might need. And managing, I suppose, that role, what role, that level of involvement that you might need to play is an important element of adjustment. And also the changes in your role that might occur when you're supporting somebody through a period of illness. Reduced communication can be a major factor reported by family members, and this can be for a variety of reasons. Often we're dealing with a lot of intense emotions, not only for ourselves as family members, but your loved one who may be going through the period of illness. That there's a lot of strong emotions which impact on communication, and which means that we're more vulnerable to misinterpreting things and more vulnerable to tiptoeing around people and not communicating exactly what it is we want to say or what we might need to say. Difficulty managing crises and navigating access to services, maybe in times of crisis. Significant levels of burden and grief in their own role. And like that, supporters may experience their own mental health difficulties, and this is something that we need to be really mindful of. Family members often find it really challenging to know when to step in and when to step back. And often this can be solved through education and through good communication between yourself and your loved one. And it's about figuring out a level of support that works for you and recognizing that this will change dependent on your needs and dependent on the needs of your loved one. And like that, family members can often struggle to get the balance between caring for themselves and caring for the person. So we'll be talking a little bit about that later on in today's lecture about how to support yourself. So these are some of the emotions that family members would report experiencing when they're supporting somebody who's ill. And you can see there it's a broad range of feelings, from good feelings to more challenging feelings to things that are very difficult to accept and very difficult to deal with. And it's important just to acknowledge that broad range of emotions that family members can experience, because often we're just trying to survive and we're just trying to get through and focus on the other person or the person we love. But that means that we're often maybe ignoring our own emotional experiences and not tending to what we need to tend to look after our own self. Every experience is different and every family is unique. And this is really important to say. So while there's common patterns of experiences of families, and that's what I was talking to there a moment ago, we know that that's really dependent on a range of different factors. So different emotional reactions, so how we all react as individuals, the nature of the pre-existing relationships. Maybe you've had really strong relationships in the past, which have maybe become distant now due to illness. Maybe there's been long-standing difficulties or maybe a lack of disconnection in the relationship. The nature, the stage and severity of the illness can all impact on how we approach the situation and how we cope with it. Other things that might be happening in the environment can really impact on how a family will deal with these stressors. So that might include other things that might be going on in the family. It might include access to available supports. It might include different pressures that we all might be under in our own environments. One of the things that family members will often talk about, and I mentioned there about finding it difficult to get the balance between stepping in and stepping back. And really, this needs to be led by the individual. But it's worth considering that family roles can be hugely impacted by the presence of illness, and particularly during times of crisis. So when we talk about family roles, we're referring to repeated patterns of behavior that are needed to fulfill function and needs within a family. So we all play different roles within our families, whether we're aware of it or not. And that these roles can often change during a crisis. So people may take on different tasks or assume new responsibilities, and this can often cause change within the family system. So families possibly need to adapt to new or increased responsibilities, practical lifestyle changes, and a disruption in maybe social and leisure activities while you're going through maybe a period of illness or a period of crisis. For the individual, at the heart of the situation, what we know is that there can often be some grief and upset around loss of roles that they might have played before they became ill. So there can be a period of adjustment, maybe when they're going through acute phase of the crisis, before they resume maybe roles that they find a benefit to them and are of importance to them. That oftentimes people find within their own families that the role of illness becomes a part of their family dynamic, and people might feel constrained and they might feel overprotected or treated with kid gloves, for example. And this can cause conflict and some difficulties in communication. But again, all of that can be resolved in terms of education, good planning, good problem solving. For the person themselves, we often find that it might mean that they might have difficulty to open up and ask for help, sometimes due to a feeling of being out of control and helplessness because people may be doing things for them, or there's a lack of communication, which again can lead to some withdrawal or a lack of confidence for the individual themselves. All of these issues tend to resolve with time and as the crisis subsides, but we do know that some of these role changes may require a discussion between families about how best to adjust and how best to resume roles that you would have performed prior to maybe experiencing illness or going through a crisis. So for family members, we know that there's a number of role changes. So the increased responsibility, stress within relationships, feeling and a perception that they need to be alert for monitoring changes, which family members might take on themselves or may feel is an assumed expectation for themselves. And that's why it's important that we have open communication, because that may not be an expectation, but perhaps through your own experience of anxiety or feeling helpless, that you want to do everything you can to support the person who has gone through the illness episode. There might be particular difficulty for children if they're maybe taking on more adult-like tasks, or maybe responsibilities that are not appropriate to their own age. And these are issues that we'll often talk about with service users when they're going through their own recovery journey. So your own role within your family means that you'll often have different needs. So the needs of a spouse or a partner are very different to the needs of maybe a sibling or a parent. And so we know that, for example, for parents of adult children, they can often find it really difficult, particularly for parents of young adults, to get the information they might need, because it's the period of great transition and a great adjustment when they are being treated as an adult within adult services, but very much still a child within the family environment. So that can often, benefit from family support and family intervention to help family members transition with that. Partners, for example, may be taking on much more roles than they would previously be used to, and that might be a new change in the relationship, and that might need a bit of extra attention and extra support. Children, whether that's siblings or children of service users, may require more information, and there's lots of good resources on age-appropriate information for children, which we can direct family members to. And within our own information centre within St. Patrick's Mental Health Services, there's lots of good resources there for children, explaining mental health in an age-appropriate way. I also have contained some information on websites that might be relevant for those of you who are maybe supporting somebody where there's children in the family. So I suppose I mentioned earlier that I was going to talk a little bit about the two elements of supporting somebody when they're going through a period of mental illness or addiction. So the first one is about, family members would often say, I need to get information on how do I support my loved one? What is involved with that? What do I need to do? What's the best way, right or wrong thing to say? And then the second element of that is how to support yourself as a supporter. I think it's important to start with what service users say they want from their supporters, because often there can be a lot of assumptions about the roles that family members may play, and a lot of unspoken expectations that are important to clarify and important to communicate exactly what kind of role you would like to play, but also what kind of level of involvement is comfortable for the service user. So research with service users has shown that service users identify people as a support who care about you, who empathize with you, who provide validation and affirmation, who don't have it all figured out. And that's really key, because often when we're in a position of helplessness and anxiety, we want to do the thing that'll make the anxiety go down. And often that's about providing suggestions or providing advice, or why don't you do this, or why don't you do that? And we know that, when you're going through a period of illness, that this can be difficult to take on and will often cause a bit of tension in the communication between family members and their loved one. So we know that listening and really listening and connecting into what your relative might be feeling, even if you can't identify it with yourself or you find it difficult to understand, is really important. So you'll see there at the end that service users say the most valuable thing that a supporter can do is listen. So this is just an important thing to start with, because as I said, people can often jump in thinking that they have to play a certain role, but really it's guided by the individual and at a pace that they feel comfortable with. So it can be helpful to have a discussion with the person about the illness, about its management, and how you can help, and that might help you both to deal with the situation in a way that feels comfortable for you. the timing of this discussion is really important, and it's best not to do this when the person themselves doesn't feel ready, or to do it when the person is relatively well. To try to keep the lines of communication open, but also try to avoid conversations that are dominated by illness. Often when people maybe come out of hospital or they're recovering from a period of illness, they find it difficult that maybe, they're building up their confidence again, and a lot of the conversations that they might be having are dominated by illness or illness recovery. Using language that's comfortable for you in these discussions. So if you want to talk with your relative, it's about using your own words and using, not feeling the pressure to use jargon or professional language. Just asking what you can do to help. So being open as much as you can, and giving yourself time to have that discussion about what might be helpful. A lot of people might not know what will be helpful in the moment, but it might be just giving it time to reflect and say, you might not have the answer right now, but maybe have a think about it, see what's comfortable for you, and we can talk about this again and return to the conversation if necessary. This is a really useful guide for family members, and it shows, I suppose, how complex it can be to be a supporter. Because your involvement and how involved to be is dependent on lots of factors. So this diagram was done by Burke et al, and it's contained within a guide for caregivers of people with bipolar disorder, and it's done by the Origin Youth Health Centre. So there's a reference for this at the end of the guide, of the end of the presentation, if you would like more information, or if you're supporting somebody with a diagnosis of bipolar. So the different factors I suppose we have to consider when you're thinking about how involved to be is, I suppose, what support is realistic. And we always say this, you need to be realistic about the level of support that you can provide and what's sustainable. So often the support that a caregiver or a supporter can provide during a period of crisis is not a sustainable level of support, and is often response to maybe the anxiety and stress of the situation, but might not be needed longer term. And that's important to say, is that the person themselves should be, we should be guided by them and what kind of level of involvement works for them, and in line with maybe the severity of their illness, and considering what are the likely consequences of helping or not helping in a certain way. So within this, we aim to be effective rather than right. So thinking about, if our goal is to support our loved one in the recovery, what gets us closer to that goal and what might get us further away. And another factor in considering how to be involved is what other supportive people are around. So thinking about the wider family system, thinking about the community, thinking about the mental health services that are available to your relative, and factoring that in terms of having a balanced level of involvement for your own well-being as much as anything else. It can be helpful to take time to think about your own needs as a supporter before, I suppose, often when you're going through a period of crisis, you're just going from one moment to the next and you're just trying to get through that stressful period. So we're not accustomed to thinking about our own needs or taking the time to reflect on what we might need. And this could be a useful time maybe for you to do that. If you've taken the time today to join this talk, maybe now is a good time to think about, what do I need? And what level of support is comfortable for me? Because as I've said, every family is unique and your own support needs will be different, and they'll change over time depending on what might be going on for you, or other factors that might be going on for the person that you're supporting. So the Meridian Family Programme, which is a programme which has been developed and researched and has been proven to improve relapse rates for people of certain diagnoses, they've developed a number of booklets with the UK mental health organisation Rethink. I've included the reference at the end of the presentation, but for the purposes of this slide and this section, I'm going to draw your attention to some work they've done on how best to identify your needs as a family member. So they've broken down some of the different needs that family members might have into information, being a carer, considering the impact on the wider family, worries about the future, and personal needs. So it's important that you match your strategy to your goal. If you're here tonight and you're thinking, I need to get more information, I need to know more about this illness, I need to know how to access services, I need to know what questions to ask, I need to know how to get help in the event of a crisis, then I suppose your information, your needs lie and center around your need for information. So how we would match your strategy to your goal, we'd be thinking about, consider what you'd like to know more. What specifically do you find maybe challenging to understand, or is there an area maybe with regard to medication you'd like to know more? To discuss with your relative the potential for a family meeting or to have contact with your mental health team. So whether you have consent to do that or whether you can contact them directly to ask for specific information, because really we know that can help the person in recovery immensely if you have access to good quality information and that's guided by the people involved and working in partnership with the service user in recovery. To prepare a list of questions or specific issues in advance of discussion. So people often find that this can be really helpful to do, as maybe if you set up a family meeting, you might go in and you might forget the things that are of maybe priority importance for you to talk about, as other issues might come to the fore. So it's important to be as prepared as possible as you can be to look for the information you might need. So other needs you might have is like around being a carer itself. So not so much about, supporting your loved one with an illness, but how this might be impacting on you, feeling a different range of emotions and maybe concerns and worries for the future. So a strategy for looking at that might be considering your own self-care plan, and we'll be talking about that in a moment. To consider your available options for peer support, which we know is the most valuable form of support, and it can be really priceless to meet and talk with other people who might be going through similar circumstances that you're experiencing. Attending to your own limits. So we'll be talking a little bit later on about observing your own limits, but this can be a really essential part of being a supporter of somebody who's going through illness or living with illness. So impact on the family. So you might be experiencing difficulties with communication. There might be increased tension and strain. So it might just be about taking the time to acknowledge the difficulties. It might be practicing communication and problem solving skills, two areas we know which can be really helpful in building up family skills and building up family coping. And if you feel you might benefit from it, it might be considering forms of support for the family unit, like family therapy. It might be behavioral family therapy, which is a structured, specific intervention. It might be family connections, which is a program we run in the hospital for people supporting someone with borderline personality disorder. So there's lots of different options out there, but it's just about finding one that supports you in your own role. I suppose to go back to thinking about how best to get the information you might need, we know that when you're in the midst of a crisis or when there's an acutely stressful situation, we don't always have the capacity to take in the information we might need. So accessing timely and quality information can have significant benefits. We know that that's not always easy to do so, and that can be sometimes the information is not shared, you're not provided with specific details, maybe you're giving too vague or too general information, that it's not timely. So we know that people learn best when they're not stressed, when they have time to reflect, and that's not often the case for family members who's supporting somebody living with illness. And that issues may change, overlap and develop over time. There is an awful lot of overlap in modern psychiatry. So maybe diagnosis may change, maybe care plans might change depending on what's going on for your loved one. So regularly, I suppose, reviewing the access to information is an important part of your own journey as well. These are some of the common questions that family members might have, and these are things that might be helpful for you to know about. Now, I can't answer these questions specifically because there's a broad range of people here this evening, but I suppose just thinking whether you might need to get this information from your own designated point of contact within your the mental health service your loved one is attending. So perhaps that's the hospital here in St. Pat's, and perhaps that's a community about mental health team, but it's thinking about what if there's a designated point of contact for families and what kind of supports they might have, what kind of pathways for engagement are there, and services will have this information readily available. What's on in an MDT, who's involved, what are recommended treatments, and that can be diagnosis specific. What can I do to help and support, and where can I go for help and support? So all that information is there, but often it's not well advertised or not as accessible as you'd like it to be. So it just might be about getting in touch maybe with a point of contact on your loved one's mental health team and getting them to direct you exactly to where you might need to get information. And I have included some information, general sources of information that might be helpful, which we'll discuss now in a moment. I suppose we know that mental health problems are usually happen as a result of a combination of factors, and this is really important to stress, because they're not straight. They can be not straightforward. There can be lots of factors might be impacting on your loved ones' difficulties and how they've developed. And a comprehensive assessment of these challenges and strengths is an essential part of your care planning, and it can also help everyone to understand how these problems have developed and what kind of treatments would help the person best. It's worth saying that developing an understanding, so it's not just having information, it's developing that understanding, and navigating an appropriate treatment and care can take time. That it doesn't always happen on the first engagement, that things can take time to build relationships and to build understanding. And that's true of services, but it's also true of families. So you'll see here on the right side is a diagram of from the Meridian Family Programme booklets, which looks at an overview of how mental health problems can develop, and to consider that from your own relative's perspective. And we would often think with individuals about how they can do this for themselves and gain a better understanding of their own story and what kind of factors have contributed for them. But this can also be helpful for family members themselves. Some of the most common mental health problems are listed there, and their identified supports are on the column next to it. So you'll see these are some of the main mental health difficulties that we are supporting individuals with and that we're coming across. So there's a broad range of difficulties that people can experience when they experience mental health difficulties, but there's also a broad range of supports that are available, and it's about finding the right kind of support that works for you. So I mentioned there about some general information sources that might be helpful. So Mind and Rethink are both UK mental health websites that have really good family-friendly fact sheets that could be helpful. And they cover a broad range of mental health problems, but they also cover a broad range of treatments and things that you can do as a carer to support yourself. The Royal College of Psychiatrists has psychiatric information on mental health disorders and illnesses that might also be helpful. So there's other websites as well there which can provide family support, such as the Family Connections Programme. The HSE has a whole range of information on their website about that programme, and there's a video series there that people can access, and that's specifically for somebody who might be supporting somebody with borderline personality disorder. Mental Health Ireland and Copami and Mindspace, there are different websites that might provide information for families. Copami is an Australian website that has lots of specific information on how to talk with children about mental health difficulties, and it breaks that down through age group, which can be really helpful to know more about. So I mentioned there that having information is somewhat different than understanding, and that understanding is often a process, and it's helpful to consider that as a work in progress. So it might be moving from knowing nothing or very little to knowing and understanding more about your relative or your friend's particular mental health problem. It's about taking some time to think about the information that you might need, which could be different from the next person who might be supporting somebody. It might be thinking about how this will change. Your needs for information might change over time, and the extent of your involvement with your friend or relative will vary over time. So the amount and type of information you might need will also vary. I suppose one thing that we know is essential to supporting somebody with a mental health problem is communication. And being in the role that you might be in, developing your own communication skills and attending to the emotions that can sometimes interfere with our communication is really important. Um, there's a saying and coined by the Meridian Family Program that often when illness comes through the door, communication goes out the window. And any of us who've supported someone going through a period of illness will know this very well. Family members may stop communicating with each other, largely sometimes due to fear and worry. It might be upset over things that have happened. It can be difficult to listen to each other and take in new information in a crisis. So good communication is therefore key. But again, it is requires that we are mindful of our own emotions and our own well-being. So I suppose some kind of key elements to thinking about our own communication, and these are skills that are often form part of structured family interventions for carers and supporters. So it can be looking at building up our skills in communication, such as active listening. It might be making a positive request for change. It might be expressing your feelings about a certain behavior or asking for help. It might be reaching a compromise together, and it might be communicating about positive things. So that's just an overview of some of the kind of key skills that they say are required for family members and any family going through a period of illness or crisis. One, I suppose, element of communication that we often find can be really important, and it ties back to, I suppose, what service users themselves say is really important for recovery, is validation. So validation is a specific form of communication, which is essentially about understanding what the other person is saying and feeling and communicating that you understand that in a clear way. So we know that validation decreases emotional arousal. It communicates compassion and understanding. It makes problem solving easier because the emotional arousal comes down. Validation may seem straightforward, but it can often be really difficult if you're experiencing a lot of intense emotions yourself, a lot of worry, a lot of maybe frustration, and there may be conflict there. It can be very difficult to take the time to say, I understand where you're coming from, and it's okay to feel the way you do. Because you yourself may be experiencing a lot of anxiety, and it may be hard to provide the validation that the other person might need. It also can be really difficult to provide validation to others when we're invalidating ourselves. So that is when we're not acknowledging the impact of difficult life events on us, when we're not tending to our own emotions and we're just pushing our own needs aside. Part of that is relationship mindfulness, which is another thing we can often look at when a family member is going through a period of illness. So relationship mindfulness is essentially a specific application of mindfulness to relationships. So it's about being mindful of another person and or your current conversation with that person. It means paying attention to them, getting and staying balanced, trying to reduce judgments. So judgments are generally unhelpful and they get in the way of us expressing ourselves clearly and resolving difficulties and communicating accurately. Focusing on your goal within the relationship. So again, I've mentioned this before, it's about aiming to be effective rather than right. So often in a crisis, we become more focused on the black and white, more focused on the wrong and the right. And within that, we often lose our capacity to be as effective as we can be, because we are often just trying to get ourselves our point across and get through to a solution focused stage when that might not be the right thing in the moment, and it might not make us as effective as we can be. So aiming to be as effective and aiming not to make the situation at least any worse. So relationship mindfulness is about responding, not reacting. And it's about decreasing emotional reactivity, our own emotional arousal, and supporting our own emotional vulnerability. So we're much less likely to respond in an effective way when we're feeling stressed, when we're not sleeping, when we're not eating, when we're not looking after our own emotional well-being. So I mentioned earlier that there can be core elements to communication which form part of structured family interventions and core communication skills. Along with those communication skills, the Meridian Family Program focus in on problem solving, and they've developed a 6-step approach to problem solving. And this might be helpful for you if you're encountering a specific difficulty, or there's an area that you want to give particular attention, or a specific problem that is recurring within your family. We often say that you don't practice these skills with the most complex situations. So you start simple and you try this out with maybe your family member. You don't go to the most difficult thing first, but it involves really pinpointing and targeting exactly what the problem might be, to list all possible solutions and ideas. So at the beginning, you think about every solution and idea, even if maybe you don't agree with it. It's about getting everybody's perspective, to evaluate the costs and benefits of each idea, and then to agree together on the best solution. And then plan to implement the solution and review it if needed. So that's just a general and I suppose very brief overview of some of the steps involved in problem solving within family structured interventions. But it might be helpful for you to consider this as a useful way to approach maybe some particular problems that you might be experiencing in your own role. So again, there's some key elements to that. So it's being specific as possible, starting with something simple, only dealing with one issue at a time. Unfortunately, if there's been a breakdown in communication, we know that there can be a build-up of issues and a build-up of emotions, which mean that once we start talking about issues, they can all come out at once, which means that we're much less likely to be as effective as we might need to be. So only dealing with one issue at a time to ensure that you're understanding each other correctly, and that you're not making inferences or judgments about what's happening and whose fault it might be, or whose fault you might think it might be, and committing to a solution. That's a really important part. It's important that you know that the discussion is going to come to something, and there'll be a plan in terms of resolution. Some things to consider if you're approaching problem solving discussions with your relative is being very clear about what you want to gain from the discussion, and what goal you want to achieve, and reflecting on that. Being aware of timing. So is the time right? Can my relative handle this right now? Does this seem like a good time to tackle this discussion? And if it is, to tell the person what your goal is, and discuss it, compromise, and proceed from there. There's some specific areas in terms of problem solving that can be useful to address, and part of that can be looking at relapse prevention. So when a person is relatively well, you can make plans with what might be helpful for you or them to do if they become ill again. Making plans in advance helps us to be more prepared, and it can also help the person get exactly the kind of treatment and support they might need in the moment. Things that might be helpful to consider within this is what the individual and family goals are for recovery. So what's working well, what you want to keep doing, and what maybe isn't working as well, and what you'd like to be different, or roles you'd like to resume. What works well in terms of support. So how do you know when it is the time to step back? And having those discussions can be helpful as part of a relapse prevention plan. And that's usually a good time to have it, because you can acknowledge, particularly maybe if somebody's leaving hospital, that is a good time to have a discussion about what kind of support they might need and what level of involvement is comfortable. To discuss any early warning signs. So these are the subtle signs that things are maybe not going as well, or the person may be exhibiting some signs of illness, and how to discuss if you do have concerns about that. So family members will often say, well, how do I discuss that with the person? And again, that goes back to what feels comfortable for the person, and navigating a compromise and a balance level around that. Lots of people, might have, recovery is not a smooth path. It's very often up and down. It's not a linear process. We all have slips and surges, and it's about thinking about what happens when you have those up and downs. And communication can make that easier, because it's not a set response. It means that we can be as flexible as we can be in our approach to support. And it also might be a helpful time to consider specific situations, like maybe how to respond to bizarre beliefs or hearing voices. It might be about how to deal with social withdrawal, how to set realistic goals, or to support somebody who may be self-harming. Relapse prevention can be discussing that with your loved one can be an important part of those discussions can be an important part of relapse prevention, and a helpful time to consider in advance what helps and maybe what hinders. So also part of relapse prevention is considering a crisis plan. And that might be who to contact in a crisis, when and how to act maybe on your relatives' behalf if they wish you to do so, what information to provide, what services they're engaged with, and the role of the Mental Health Act. And the Mental Health Commission have produced a guide for family and friends on the admission process involving the Mental Health Act, which is available on their website, which is www.mhcirl.ie. So that details the admission guide, and it's specifically made for families and friends. So you might find it helpful to read up on that if maybe this has been part of your experience, or you want to know more about the Mental Health Act itself. So we know that this can be helpful to do when the person is relatively well. And also, I suppose, crisis planning can address maybe any issues of safety and how you can be most helpful to the person in the time of maybe distress, or if there are concerns about safety. It can include sometimes what's acceptable and what's not acceptable in terms of your own role, and it may consider how best to get the person help they need in an acute crisis. So within that situation, it's important that the situation managed to ensure everyone's safety. So if you're worried about your loved one's immediate safety, it's vital for you to seek help from your GP, an identified mental health team, or to attend A&E. And all of these details, I suppose, can form part of a crisis plan. So I suppose those elements, so we're thinking getting information, communication, problem solving, relapse prevention, they really center on you as a supporter and how best can you support your loved one in recovery. And obviously, we've just given a broad overview there, and it's beyond the scope of this lecture to consider specifically those issues. But as throughout the series, we'll be revisiting those topics and thinking best on how you can address those issues yourself in your own role. But I suppose what's general to everybody, and we know this to be true, is how best to care for yourself, and that you need to care for yourself. So I've mentioned there that communication is essential, and how we manage our emotions is really important to how we communicate. So it can be really important to tend to the intense emotions that often arise when you're caring for somebody through a period of illness. So that might mean taking a break to restore your own energy. It might mean managing unrealistic expectations, so checking in with what expectations you have for yourself, what are you expecting yourself to do, and what are you expecting yourself to cope with. To observe your own limits and manage boundaries on your time and your resources. We all have limits, and nobody can manage stress that's unmanageable, so it's important you take care with that. To develop your own support system. So I mentioned peer support earlier, but it might be talking with your friends, it might be talking with other family members, it might be, looking at your hobbies and your interests, things that give you resources and give you support. To acknowledge your own natural reactions and be mindful of these emotions that you may feel like, supporting somebody with a mental health difficulty is somewhat of an emotional roller coaster, and that's okay. That's normal and very common. You may not feel that way, but it's important that your own emotions are valid and that you acknowledge them for your own well-being. So some important considerations in mind in your own emotional vulnerability is taking care of any physical health problems you might have, to looking after your diet and your sleep hygiene, to making time for other relationships, being as compassionate to yourself as you can be, trying to accumulate the positives. Sometimes when we're under stress, we're often repeating to ourselves, I can't cope, or this is too much. And our thinking can focus on the things that we can't do, or the things that we're finding very challenging. So it can be helpful to think about, things that you feel are positive or going well, to achieve some of that balance. Sometimes it can be helpful to do a cope ahead plan, which is looking at, if the situation becomes more stressful, or if this happens, what will I do then? And how will I best support myself? So that really looks like developing your own self-care plan. So as I've mentioned, your needs as a carer or supporter are individual to you, and they may change over time. Oftentimes when somebody is, for example, is in hospital, family members will often say to me is, I don't really need to look after myself. What I need to do is help my loved one. And once they're okay, I'll be okay. And we know that's a natural response to a stressful situation, but we also know it's really important to look after yourself, because you're not in a position to look after others if you don't do that. So a self-care plan can help us to consider how best to support your well-being and how to proactively manage your stress. So it might be useful if you are thinking about this, and if this is something you want to give attention to, and if you are supporting somebody in an ongoing way, I would really urge you to do this. Your needs are as important as anybody else's, and taking the time to look at how you'll look after yourself is essential. So it might be evaluating your current coping skills. So how do you typically deal with stress? What kind of works for you? Do you readily know when you need to take a break? Are you okay with saying no, for example? What are you doing to support your overall well-being on a day-to-day basis? Are there things that you need to do every day to kind of keep yourself well and keep stress at bay? What's working and what might need to change, and developing a plan from there. And this doesn't need to be overly complicated, but it might be looking at, what do I do if stress arises? Paying attention to maybe one or two things I can do for myself within a day. And that could be small little things, but it's just about creating the attention to look after yourself. A really important part of caring for somebody, maybe in an ongoing way, is observing your own limits. So we often only really know our limits when they've been reached. And family members will often say, how do I set boundaries? And that's often coming from a place of stress and feeling overwhelmed, and feeling uncertainty about what's helping or what's hindering. So it can be helpful to have this, to think about this in advance. So if we only know our limits when they've been reached, it's likely that we're under a lot of pressure. So if you think in advance, what behavior or what things you're willing to accept or not accept, you'll be better able to respond in the moment, rather than reacting dependent on your own emotional state or what might be going on for you at that time. Because circumstances do make a difference. It matters when somebody does something deliberately, as opposed to other stressful things that might be happening over time. And it's worth saying that your limits shift and change over time dependent on your own needs. So trying to get the balance with this can be challenging. But we know it's important because it helps reduce burnout, it helps to preserve the relationships you're trying to keep, and it helps to preserve your own sense of self. How do we do that? Identify what you're willing to accept, and what feels too much for you. Maybe identify what goes beyond your own limit and your own self-respect, and accept that it's okay to say no. So that might be thinking about your own expectations of yourself within your own role. And then communicating that limit. So it might be thinking about things that might make you feel uncomfortable, that you're not sure of, that you'd like maybe to change within your relationship. It's observing how that feels for you. It's noticing when it happens, and telling the person that you're uncomfortable with the behavior or the issue, and that you're finding it difficult to manage and you'd like that to change. Validating that that's also hard, but that it's important for your relationship. A big part of supporting somebody with going through illness and living with illness is knowing how to self-advocate. So as a carer or supporter, you can often feel lost, and it can be often difficult to know, as I said, how to get the information, how to help and how to help your loved one. So there's some kind of core elements to self-advocacy, which include knowing your own rights. So knowing what kind of permissions have been allowed for you to share information or get information, deciding what your own goals and what your loved one's goals are for recovery, getting facts, so getting factual information and giving yourself the time to be able to take that in. So that might be in small chunks, not loads of information all at once. And I'm conscious that we've talked about a lot of different topics this evening, but it's about breaking it down to find the information that works for you best. Having a strategy with your loved one to get, if you're struggling to get support or services that you might need, to expressing yourself clearly, asserting yourself calmly, and being firm and persistent. So they're kind of core elements of self-advocacy, which might be helpful for you. It might also be helpful to consider accessing specific family supports dependent on your own situation. So there's a broad range of supports available to families within Ireland dependent on your needs. So for example, if you have young children, TUSLA 24/7 parenting website has lots of really good resource information and videos on parenting. Barnardo's too also has lots of good fact sheets and leaflets on parenting issues, and also have family centres across the country that deal with family specific issues. Family Carers Ireland have an online programme for carers and supporters, and they also have good resources for carers to help them in their role. Recovery College too often run workshops for families that may be helpful to know about, as does Aware. Alzheimer's Ireland has specific training for family carers, which if you're supporting somebody with Alzheimer's or dementia might be helpful for you to access. Parent Line similarly has Parent Plus courses, group programs that you can access peer support. Safe Ireland has specific supports for victims of domestic violence or those experiencing abuse in relationships, and you can get specific supports through their member organisations. Shine also has a family support coordinator that is for mental illness and can be a helpful resource for family members in recovery. In terms of the family webinar, we have a range of upcoming webinars that are intended to provide specific information. So we know that family members often receive the best information when they're specific to their loved ones, maybe difficulty or challenge. And so we've taken that information on board. We've also had consultations with the Service User Advisory Network to find out what service users feel their family members need to know. So with that in mind, the topics have been designed with those two factors in consideration. So next month will be a lecture on trauma recovery, understanding that from a family perspective, and it will be undertaken by Dr. Clodagh Dowling. In December, we'll look at eating distress. In January, we'll look at supporting a loved one with addiction, and so on from there. The schedule will consider different issues for family members who may have different needs. Today was intended to be a general overview of what family members might experience and different areas that you might find helpful to look at in terms of finding more information or accessing more support. We hope that you will continue to get more information and you'll join us for the upcoming webinars, and that you can get the support that you might need. You can register for the next lecture via our website, and we'll take questions for the Q&A now in a moment. Just to point you in the direction of some resources that might be helpful for you as a family. But again, this is about considering, not overwhelming yourself with information, but considering how best to meet your own needs and taking the time now to think about what those needs exactly are and to match your strategy. So, do I need information? Do I need to look after myself? Do I need to have a conversation with my loved one about how best to support them? And taking the time to do that now, and taking the time to look after yourself. So I'll thank you all for joining us this evening, and we'll move on to the Q&A now.